Lammy, we were just talking about storms before we started recording, which is maybe an interesting way into talking about environments and biomes, which is a word that you used at the end of the last episode. Why did you want to talk about this in these specific terms? Like we were talking about geography before. What is it about environment and biomes that you wanted to address more specifically this time?
I think something that I keep coming back to is atmosphere in a game. And I think obviously the environment and the setting, therefore the biomes, another word for that, is a big part of that. So, in thinking a lot about atmosphere, but also in thinking about what you were talking about last time, which is how a developer can sort of beef a game up and make it larger by just skinning similar kinds of levels with new, would be an interesting thing to talk about. And literally, just as we started talking now, the rain has started coming down. Big raindrops I can see hitting the back deck. So it's going to be a moody episode on my side.
Well, I have no access to the weather here. It could be sunny or dark. The sun might even be gone from the sky as far as I know. I'm in a completely windowless room. But but I do understand what you mean about atmosphere. And I like it when a game in a similar way to how other art forms take me to another place through atmosphere. The atmosphere doesn't have to act upon me or even be an obstacle to another character or my character or part of the plot to make me feel like I'm engaged in something special and that I'm immersed in another reality. Part of it is the audio, but a big part of it too is the visual. So when you mention, a thunderstorm, yeah, there's a lot of games I can think of where you're in a thunderstorm, and whether or not that's acting on your character, it's part of the player's experience of being in that world. We've talked before about how games are a lot of them occur in your own mind, whether it's a board game, a card game, or a video game. The decision making, the agency that you're taking, the immersion in another world is happening in your own mind. But that is being prodded along by cues on a screen. And so I think part of this discussion is this word atmosphere, which is so interesting. Like, is there a game for you which really nailed the feeling of being in another world through the sound and through the visuals more than any other?
The game I keep coming back to for atmosphere, and I've talked about it before, is the one I come back to because it was the first time I really experienced gaming in this way. That's Limbo. So I've talked about it before. It was sort of a very short puzzle platformer back when indie games were first having their biggest kind of heyday. It's a short game. Highly recommend you pick it up. It's got a very specific art direction. All monochromatic and kind of um, you know a world that doesn't seem inviting at all, but very simple as well. And that was one of the first times where I really appreciated the artistry that could go into a video game in that way. And it really sparked a lot of my interest in seeing more artistic type games and in noticing that, you don't need this kind of triple A developer to get something that is really unique, interesting. Um, I think another one that we've talked about recently that would also fit is the first act of Inscryption. You don't necessarily need the best graphics. There's something just that really pulls you in and can feel so like, wow, this is a different feeling. This is a different view than I would normally have. We talked about that, how that first person sort of, you can see the cards in your hands, and sure, games have done that before, but with the added thing of kind of this spooky, you know, cabin D&D feel, really made you feel more like you were there, and at least made me think of, oh wow, they're really doing something different and interesting with this. um so yeah, I mean, those are kind of, I don't know if they're necessarily the best. I think they're the most influential for me, in how they, make me feel when I'm playing, which is part of it. I mean, obviously Outer Wilds is hugely amazing, but the graphics had never been its strongest uh, part, right? I think the sound design though for the environments are very good. You can't not say that it isn't, great, because actually environments and biomes are something that Outer Wilds specifically does really, really well. But we can't talk about it as fully as I would like yet. We'll have to leave that one for another time.
That's okay. Don't worry about it. This is not our Outer Wilds episode. It is coming. We'll maybe do it 7 years from now, but it will. It will. It will. When they hopefully are they releasing more expansions to it, or is it a completed game now? Outer Wilds. Do you know?
Yeah, so there had been a new expansion. I think it came out just about a year ago now, which is crazy. And that's the only expansion. Oh, I feel like they just recently posted a teaser, um, but I don't know what it means. I was watching somebody start a new Outer Wilds playthrough, and I noticed there's a portion right at the beginning that you have played in the museum that says coming soon, which is interesting. And I don't know if that's an in-game, like, oh, look, the museum has a new, coming soon section, or if they're also trying to tell us that there might be more coming soon. But they did release one DLC, which is the bit that I need to play through still. And people say that it's just as good as the original bits. So, uh, you know, a game that I didn't think DLC would be possible for seems to have done it successfully, which is quite surprising. But yeah, it the first part of the game without the DLC is a very complete section, and they suggest that you play the DLC after finishing the kind of non-DLC.
I find it Outer Wilds to be a beautiful game, and I can spend time watching the game pass by as I'm traveling from planet to planet, or just walking around on a planet is a pleasurable experience. I think a big part of that, as you mentioned, is the sound design, but the visuals too can be quite stunning. And dealing with orbital mechanics, and so how planets are moving around in unexpected ways, which can kind of trip you up from our three-dimensional earthbound reality. When things are moving in such a way, it can be more interesting to look at than we might expect. I wonder. So I don't know if I've ever played a AAA game, at least not since that term has come into vogue. With The Witcher 3, I've played maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes of. I just started it. I won't have time anytime soon to play it, but that's a game that I know I want to get into. But that wasn't, I don't know if that was considered AAA at the time or not, but that's a game which was only a few weeks ago that I played this. I felt the atmosphere at the very beginning was so powerful and immersive that I could have just watched it happen. I didn't even feel the need to play. I felt like I could just watch this go on, which is maybe part of the game. Like you're in a character that has had a life before you. You're not generating it. So in a way, you are following a story, and I'm predicting about how the game will unfold. I've read a bit about it, but which is already contoured for you. It's not a sandbox game. But there was a feeling that I can just sit back and watch this a little bit rather than feel I have to act upon the game. Are there games like that for you where you feel the atmosphere is so immersive or even cinematic that I'm good to just watch this for a while? Or has that never happened? Are you always too interested in getting in there and making things happen?
I also don't play a lot of AAA games. Like I played through more Witcher 3 than you have, and little bits of things like Assassin's Creed and those kinds of games, which I think would be considered AAA. Um, I've seen and watched. I think I do enjoy watching games, and so watching others play through a game like that is almost like a movie, like a Red Dead Redemption, um, is quite enjoyable. It's just there's something very, very pleasing about it because it is nice and beautiful and engaging to watch. But in speaking about atmosphere, the one that truly, and it wasn't as much about environment specifically, this is more sound design really again, but it is Disco Elysium that for me pulled me in literally from the first few seconds of sound design, because it's completely blank, right? Speaking of environment, they just present you with darkness and the audio, and it just hooked me immediately. And in that game, similar to what you were talking about with Geralt in The Witcher, you're not really you're also kind of coming into a character that exists. Like, yes, you're making choices and you're taking roles, and there's that tabletop, but also in sort of a way, this is a character who's trying to figure out who he is. And as much as, yeah, you can sort of play him a little bit differently, I still kind of felt like, no, I was trying to just discover who he truly was. And it was almost like watching something unfold. And that was really pleasant because the world was so interesting. And of course, that was presented in terms of environments in a very weird and interesting way, because the world presented is so unnatural to us. It had a lot of, elements that weren't in the real world. So that was quite interesting to try to dig into. I forget you, because you have played some of Disco.
Oh yeah, no, I've never finished it, but I've gotten into it, and I feel good speaking about it. And in reaction to what you just said, absolutely. First of all, about sound design, also the voice acting in that game is incredible. And in a recent version of the game, they released a patch where they've actually they've added some voices, but they've redone some voices as well. They've taken different takes and voices that they thought were more appropriate. But this is a game that really focused on that aspect of it, where I think some games see that as an afterthought, a secondary element to the visuals, where probably for Disco, I'm assuming, but it seems that the writing was paramount, but just underneath that was the voice acting, and they hired really, really good people to inhabit these characters and to provide atmosphere too, and to make you feel like you were in a fully inhabited world. The other thing that Disco Elysium does really well, I think, is trick you into believing that you have a character with a blank slate. Trick you into thinking that, oh, I'm going to create this character from scratch and I'm going to tell a story, and isn't it convenient that he has memory loss so that I can kind of start over again from nothing and generate him anew. But then you bump up against his past all the time. You come up against the things that he's done, the things that he's said, and his place in the world, which is in some way malleable based on the choices you make, but there is an imprint that he's had on this world. Might be a low-level tragic imprint, but it's still there. And it's an interesting trick that the game plays, because it almost lures you in with the feeling like you get to make this up, when really you're bumping up against the reality of the past, and the past plays such an important role in that game too. But that's not a game that I would sit back and watch. I would absolutely watch someone else play it, but if I was just to watch it as if it were a movie, I don't know if I would be as interested in that. It does have some atmosphere, but not enough that the atmosphere is, again, the lure to bring me in, as opposed to the screen to let me sit back and watch it. In answer to my own question, I don't know if I know of any games. The Witcher 3 would have been an example of something that I felt for a moment I'd sit back and watch, but I don't know any other example of a game that I would not want to get in and play, where, in other words, the cinematic quality overtakes everything else. Going into this word biome, though, from a game design perspective, a biome is quite interesting. It can be the realm of the pre-generated. I think one definition of the biome is that it's a naturally occurring collection of flora and fauna in a predetermined area. But from a game design perspective, let's see, I actually wrote this down. A collection of all the predefined elements that can appear within a given game space. So we've talked about replayability before. Some scholars have talked about, and some game designers have talked about, how the biome is an opportunity for the player to feel like they're in a truly new place. Whether it's a new skinned version of the thing we've been in before, or a truly different, complete ecosystem where we're experiencing it from the beginning. So a game that has 2 or 3 biomes is inherently less replayable than one that has 12. One that has 12, you can explore any one of them, and that becomes almost a game within itself. Are there, and maybe this is a preference question, but are there biomes or environments that you seem to gravitate towards when you're playing a game? So for me, an example would be, I like being in open spaces. I like the feeling that I'm in the mountains or a forest and that I can see over a wide vista. Again, going back to The Witcher 3, one of the first things you see is you walk out onto the balcony and see this beautiful vista. And that's when I'm thinking, oh, I just want to look at this for a while. Are there examples of vistas or biomes that you gravitate towards in your gaming?
I think I would agree with that, with the kind of vistas and forests, because another one that always comes up is, again, Breath of the Wild. So there's a similar moment which is really, really cinematic. They did such a great job with it when you first wake up as Link and you look out over the land and the title screen drops and all that. And like there were videos of people playing this and just crying, right? From like the nostalgia of the game. It's so beautiful. And you do just kind of, and most people do literally take a moment and just watch, because it's so beautiful and so engaging. And I don't know if you've heard this idea about like bush cats versus tree cats, but you know, whether most cats tend to be tree cats, they like to be up high, but there are some cats who actually like to be hidden and low and hide in the bushes. And you know, I think I would be a tree cat, like looking over, like you said. Also, I enjoy climbing, so I think that's like, what's the highest point I could get to see everything. And maybe some of that for both of us is our risk aversion, where we feel like, you know, no, I need to be able to be in control of everything. And the way to be in control of everything is to see it all. Don't, you know, put me in places where I can't easily maneuver, because that's pretty limiting, or at least it can feel limiting. And actually, one of the questions I was going to ask you was a bit of the opposite one, which is, are there biomes you truly don't like? And of course, the most famous of which is waterworlds, right? Mario's underwater levels tend to be notorious for being some of the least liked, because they put the most pressure on a player. When you have a breath meter and timers and all of this, all of a sudden the difficulty just spikes up. Or maybe is it what I was just saying, that people don't feel in control and they feel more claustrophobic in those spaces. But yeah, I was going to ask you, what are your least sort of favorite biomes when you are presented with them?
Well, there's so much in what you just said that I wanted to respond to, and then you asked me the question, and now I'm forgetting what I wanted to say. Um, Actually going back specifically to Super Mario, yeah, I could definitely say that I felt the pressure of the water worlds. It was the gravity of it, the constant feeling of sinking. You know, there are places to rest, but they're few and far between. Whereas on land, you can just stand there for a second and think. You can just hold your breath. You can just hold your position, look around you, make sure there's no snake coming at you, or a bullet from a gigantic cannonball coming at. Well, it's shaped like a bullet. I remember in Super Mario, and other than that, you can stand there. But in a water world, you constantly have to do something. You have to act to stay alive constantly. I think that's part of it. There's also the slowness and the feeling of everything is a little bit off. The control doesn't work in the same way as it normally does. And you're going to fall into things, or if you jump too hard, you're going to unavoidably hit a spike or something. And so, yeah, I can definitely say that was more stressful and painful than like the dungeon worlds, which really didn't make me feel more claustrophobic than the open air worlds. It was because it's the mechanics are essentially the same. Yeah, I guess I would be a tree cat for sure. In part for the same reason that I want to see the door in front of me and not behind me. I want to have my back to the corner. If I'm in a room, I'm usually going to find the corner, not to hide in it, but just to have control. I'm not going to tell people what to do or order people around, but I just want to have a sense of the room. And if my back is to the door, then anything can happen. And maybe it's just from reading Dune when I was really young. And one of the opening concepts of the book, I think, when Paul Atreides is told never have your back to a door, and I thought that's exactly right. Never do that. So being up high in a tree, yeah, absolutely. Also just for the pleasure of it. Like when I'm traveling, one of the first things I want to do when I get to a new city or a new place is climb the closest, highest tower I can find, to get a sense of where I am, to enjoy the vista, probably also to be in a sense of control. Also, when you're at the top of a tree, there aren't any other people usually with you in the top of the tree, which is a nice feeling too. Yeah, so I would say anything that is too claustrophobic, like even if I'm thinking of a CRPG, like the Pathfinder games, Pillars of Eternity, I'm okay going into a cave or a dungeon of some kind and exploring around, but if it feels endless, I don't have nearly the same pleasure of an endless sandbox feeling of above ground for some reason. Like there's nothing more horrifying than the Underdark in D&D lore, which is this essentially endless underground caverns, which function in the same way as if you were outside, but you're constantly being oppressed by the earth on top of you. So I would say I'd have to think more about it if there's a particular biome that I don't like. There were moments in playing Outer Wilds where I felt almost suffocating from being in space, like the sense that you're running out of oxygen, the sense that you're on this planet, and if you don't get back to your ship in time, you're gonna die, or you're gonna, And you saw me because I was streaming this. I'm gonna fly back into my rocket. Oh, I'm gonna go into the sun, and I'm just gonna fly and die into the sun, and there's nothing I can do because I'm just a terrible pilot. There's something scary about space, which, for example, the movie Alien captured in 1979. Not just the monster, right? Not just the alien that's hunting these people, but the feeling that there's no escape but to this horrifying, dark, endless void. So it's almost like the opposites there, like the claustrophobic dungeon and the endless vacuum of space. Both of those kind of feel uncomfortable after a while. They can be exciting at first, but there's something unnatural about being in them. It's like, have you ever been scuba diving before?
I haven't, and I would be terrified to.
I wasn't terrified before, but I was after. I thought, oh, this is cool. I'll breathe from the oxygen tank and swim underwater for a while. And two things happened. First of all, I could never equalize. So like it was just painful. My nose was constantly in pain, and I just didn't enjoy the experience because of the physical discomfort. But there was also a sense of being under there, and I went scuba diving once. It was off of Mafia Island in Tanzania, and I wasn't very far down, probably maybe 45-minute dive, and I just felt like this is not where I belong. This is not my biome. This is not my territory. I'm a foreigner here, and I shouldn't be here. The creatures, the feeling, the visuals, the sounds, the feeling that if you, for any reason, lose track of this thing in your mouth, you will die. You can't breathe under here. You cannot function normally. Yeah, there was a feeling of again, going back to your original point about the waterworlds. Yeah, scuba diving was horrifying, but after the fact, at first I thought this was great. I'm going to jump underwater and have a great time. Yeah, but I would still recommend doing it, especially if you can equalize. And I would do it again if I could maybe have more time to figure out the physical discomfort part. But that feeling of being an alien in that world was, yeah, disturbing.
In some ways, that feeling of this isn't where I belong, to me kind of creates a voyeur feeling of humans constantly pushing and putting themselves in places that they wouldn't have otherwise had access to. And I don't know, I find something really beautiful about that, and doing the human thing that humans do and anthropomorphizing all things. I'd like to think that animals are like, huh, look at them, they figured out how to get down here, and are equally curious about us as we are about them in many ways, right? And I'd like to think of it in that nice, beautiful light of, it's true we don't belong there. I think maybe trying to make it a place that we do belong is what makes me feel kind of icky, and I don't like that. But having it be maybe like a visit, like something to try to expand our understanding of the world, and the same thing for space, is really, really exciting. So it hasn't ever hit me in that way of the fear of, let's say, the endlessness of space. Now, I think the reality, like the actual practical aspect of it, lots of people are asked if you could be on a spaceship to Mars, would you go? I would say no, just because I have a very, very strong survival instinct, not because I'm actually afraid of just the emptiness of space. I think that part is cool. I think there's something so amazing about being in this place that we kind of don't belong, getting to see it. Um, and I think that people who tend to fear the depths of the ocean are also the kinds of people that would fear the emptiness of space. There's a very similar, the endlessness, and like you said, where we don't know what's there, and there could be entire worlds we can't even begin to understand. I think that's part of what makes it both so exciting but also so terrifying, and why people generally do fear deep waters and deep space.
It would probably be the same thing for me. I think I would say yes to going to Mars, but I'd probably have the same thing happen where I'm there and then I hate it, right? with scuba diving. Because I like the idea of it, and I don't feel naturally afraid of going to a foreign place, but I think in retrospect it can be horrifying. Also, you said something that the scariness of space is that we don't know what's there. The other scary aspect of space is that we do know what's there and it's nothing forever, right? That's scary, right? Like the sense of void or close to true void is horrifying. And I remember having this fear when I was something like 9 or 10 years old and realizing, wait a minute, the universe could be infinite. Like there's no brick wall at the end of it or something to enclose us in. And I thought, well, if there was a brick wall, Ben, there'd be another side to the brick wall and it would go on forever. And the feeling of infinity, and that infinity may come up with just nothing, is horrifying. Like when I die, nothing will be my experience forever. That's also horrifying, that this just ends. And I think a lot of people turn to religion to explain or give them comfort for that, but I can't do that. So I will take the fear of the nothingness instead. And just to sit down and consider it and think about it is the scary part. Being face to face with it without thinking is not that scary. Flying in a spaceship to Mars, if I just think about it superficially, sounds cool. And as long as you keep me busy, I'll be fine on the whole way. But once you give me 2 minutes to think about it, I'm going to be crapping my pants. Yeah, and I wonder for gamers to what extent this fits into their approach to picking a game, getting into a new game, is this feeling of, obviously we're not afraid of a game. It's not going to reach out from the computer and strangle us. But we come up across experiences all the time that play with our emotions, that are scary. I don't want to go see a scary movie. I don't, like, a lot of the time someone's going to tell me that they want to see a film that has gore in it or just a horror film. I don't want to. I know that I'm going to feel crappy watching it. And I don't have the same experience with games, but I don't play horror games. And I wonder if this feeling of trepidation is present for people when they play games and enter into games in the same way we're talking about potentially going to Mars, or if there's always a feeling of invincibility when we approach it. Like, I think that's what I have, is it's my not playing a game is usually because I haven't found the time to carve out to really enjoy it. But are there games for you where you're like, ooh, I don't think I ever want to play that? Like, the film for me, Requiem for a Dream, I've seen it once. I really don't ever want to see it again, for example. Yeah.
Definitely. I don't play horror games. And I think that I kind of understand why people watch horror movies and play horror games, and I have watched horror movies if I thought that there was another important theme or purpose or reason for it, in the same way with, like, let's say overly violent movies or cinema or something that would be, I'm not interested in that unless it's trying to say something. And the cool thing is a lot of horror movies and games are trying to say something. That's kind of what the genre does well, although there's a lot in the genre that doesn't, right? It is just horror for horror's sake, and that's kind of where I, like, not interested. But Outer Wilds, for example, is a game that scared the bejesus out of me. And I didn't expect it because it's not a horror game, right? Like, that isn't what it's trying to do. And yet the fear of the unknown is so strong in that game. and having to be skillful while afraid, which is something that, you know, gamers have to get used to if you're going to play a game that is any sort of, you know, whether it's inducing anxiety and you have to perform under anxiety, whatever it is. But it's so much harder to do whatever the game needs you to do when you are also really, really scared. Even though the logical part of your brain is saying, you know, obviously everything is fine, nothing can hurt you. But I think for me, the fear is not obviously of getting hurt, but of realizing that I'm not going to be able to do the skill thing that I need to do, that the game needs me to do, because I'm scared, so I can't do the thing. And then I'm scared about that. I'm scared of the failure that is going to result in the fact that I can't do the thing. And I had a part in Outer Wilds where I handed off the controls. I said, I can't do this. And like, I think cried like a little baby. That was, and it wasn't like and I might have, one of the reasons I kind of stopped playing the DLC was also because it was getting scary. But, I think I used to not be scared of like horror movies when I was younger. It's one of those switches that once I got scared of one thing, like once that fear hit me once, it was almost unlocked for all other things. And I can tap into turning it off again. Like I've definitely been able to, reason over everything and kind of barrel through and just go like, it's just it's not real life. You're not in danger, like kind of override those systems. And so I think I can do it. It's almost like but it almost detracts, if that makes sense. Like turning off, like numbing yourself to the emotion isn't as fun. Like there is something fun in engaging with it a little, but it's hard when you don't have a way to regulate it. I don't know. I mean, Outer Wilds is 100% worth it. And I think a lot of games that I've really enjoyed, even if they had, scary elements or very, very difficult biomes. I mean, there are games that are very, very difficult, but they're so rewarding as well. And so I don't mind, and we've talked about this before, kind of pushing through that for the most part. And one thing that I really wanted to talk about before we finish up today, in terms of design space for biomes and environments, is that what I really, really love about it and what I've enjoyed is definitely the atmospheric part. But the second part is that we've talked about it in the past, but for a developer, having a new biome, a new environment to develop for provides you with new limitations, a new design space, and can focus, again, potential new features in the game, like new ways to engage with it. And I really think that's a really cool part, which is not just reskins of existing levels or anything like that, or just adding one new, let's say, property, but really, really going, okay, in this biome, because of the biome we're in, there are going to be completely new ways to interact with the environment that didn't exist in the previous ones. There's going to be different kinds of enemies because now you're here. And, you can see like where they take similarities from previous ones, but make them a little bit different because of the environment they're in. But I think that's the really cool part about having a game where you do have these differences, is that it helps you, I think, brainstorm and come up with cool new ideas and new ways for the player to engage with your game. And that's where I think biomes really work well. And the game that, for me, really, really showed this, both the atmospheric, but also just made the game feel so large, was Hollow Knight, which one day, again, please play. But this was a game that was indie developed. It's a $15 game and was kickstarted. And I guess they were just able to continue adding biomes. Like they kind of didn't know, at the start how many they were going to have. And as you play the game, you keep going like, there's more. How can there be more? How, how is there there's a new zone with, totally different art, sound, enemies, new techniques that you have to learn potentially. And it just makes the world feel big and exciting to explore. And it also plays with your emotions in the story part, because one of the really interesting things about Hollow Knight is you start in this very dead world, and the second zone that you kind of must go to is immediately alive and green and forested, and the music is different, and it really reinvigorates you in a way that you almost didn't think. There's almost this depression starting the game of how dead the world is. And the funny thing is, most of the rest of the game is even more dead than it started and is even more stark and dark. But they knew what they were doing in terms of leading a story and going, here's some, verdant greens, here's some life, here's, what it could be, maybe. And you wouldn't have that, right, without engaging with these different environments and biomes. Like, there are many games where it's just whatever the design is, it's the design for the whole game. Like Limbo. Limbo is one where there's a single, well, you could argue that there might be kind of environments and biomes, but not really. It's, this one experience for the most part. And that worked really well too, because that game had a particular thing it was trying to do and was very short. But, you can expand this game by just adding, and even for yourself as a developer, by forcing yourself to add these different ways, you could create new gaming experiences that maybe were even better than, the one idea you had to start with.
Yeah, I mean, to go back to Hollow Knight, you've mentioned it so many times that I think I have to play it just in order for our conversations to continue. You know, just to have this as a reference point. You've certainly made the pitch, and I want to play it. I think that if I play it, then we will easily have an episode of Hollow Knight that we can just carve from the many times that we'll talk about it, which is what we could do with Outer Wilds. Like, we don't actually have to have an episode about it, because we could just take all the times we've discussed it before. We'd probably have about an hour and a half worth of material at this point that we could cut together and have us talking about Outer Wilds. And there is more to talk about. For example, something you mentioned a few moments ago about this moment of fear, the crippling fear that you actually had to stop the game for a while. I've never gone deep enough into the game, but I can see that happening. There were moments when I played it where it went beyond frustration into not being able to get a task done, and something scary was happening. And I think it was the atmosphere, the music, the sound, the visuals, the sense of being in space, the sense of time running out, even though, and this is a spoiler, you just start over. It's not like the world ends. You don't even lose anything. But there's a feeling of, I don't know, maybe it's existential. And if that is true, then what an achievement for the game designers to have in that game, to create real existential dread by simply letting people play the game. Not by having them arrive at a certain level and having a message given to them, but by just playing it and experiencing it for what it is. That is a marriage of form and content that I admire. And I wonder how many other people might have felt the same thing in playing it. Of course, Doki Doki Literature Club, we talked about before, as an example of something that there is a message to it, even though there's horror. And we did talk about horror a little bit when we talked about that game. But I think what is important about that is something you hinted at, which is psychologists will argue that when we have fun with horror, we're doing what we do as kids, which is to play just enough to understand something so that we can manage and mitigate the fear and not be overwhelmed by it. As a kid, which is partly why we dream about falling off of a tall building, which is to kind of face the fear a little bit so that we're not crippled by it day to day in life when we cross a small bridge or stand over a balcony or something like that. Playing with horror, playing with fear are necessary things that we must do as human beings in order to live through day-to-day life. In a way, we have to watch movies about war in order to live in a world where there is war, so that we can face it somehow. And this is something that I think games do very well, and maybe better than other art forms, is allow us to live in something without having to deal with the consequences of it, so that when we have to face it, even from a distance in day-to-day life, we can still function and maybe get over it, maybe improve, maybe even stop these things that are happening. And that's something that games do maybe better than other forms of art. That wasn't really an answer to what you were saying, but maybe just a little bit of a detour before we end. Lammy, is there something that we talked about that you want to get into more, or something that we didn't talk about that you want to address next time we chat?
I didn't have anything as obvious this time around. And I think there are some things that we've already touched on multiple times, so maybe not another episode on them just yet. I would be happy to go back to the questionnaire that we've answered one question of so far that you had, unless there was something else that you would particularly like to.
Well, we can always the questionnaire is this thing that we can always go back to. We may never go back to it. We have probably answered so many of the questions just in our general conversation, but yeah, absolutely, we can go back to that. But I was going to ask, is there a game or are there games that you're playing right now or that you played in the last month? Not to say that we have time to talk about it, or that you're prepared to talk about it, but are there games that you are really invested in, interested in, kind of like Cult of the Lamb, which we talked about, that you were playing for a while? Is there something that's really tickling your fancy right now that you're into?
I haven't picked anything up since Cult of the Lamb, just because I was away, so I haven't had a chance. And kind of going back a little bit to other games, trying to see if I still have time in my current life for playing video games and not just watching or talking about them, which I also find very enjoyable. So there isn't anything right now. I'm trying to think if there was. I went back and played like a run of Slay the Spire the other day and was terrible at it. Like died just twice, just horribly. I'm like, I used to be good at this game, um, and I've tried to go back into my well of League of Legends play to attempt to rank up for this season, but we'll see how that goes. Um, Honestly, I don't think we'll probably have time till next time, but I would love to do an episode on Hollow Knight as well.
Yeah, I was gonna suggest that. I don't know when we will, but let's put that on the docket for some point in the future, or we'll have to stitch it together ultimately. Okay, Lammy, that sounds good. Great conversation. There's a lot here that I'm gonna have to take notes on because I wanted to address and dig into further. Not necessarily about biomes, but what games do through biomes and environments and atmosphere, and what they could do, what maybe they haven't done yet. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.